Hey, what's up? Welcome to the Real Talk podcast. And during this podcast, we like to talk about a range of topics just about life and Christianity and the Bible and church. And sometimes we like to sprinkle in more of maybe a juicy topic. And this topic is something that maybe everyone knows happens, but doesn't get talked about a lot. And so this is kind of a pastor confession. What is it like when someone leaves your church, right? We talk a lot about when people come into the church. We talk a lot about when people step up to lead and to serve. And what happens in the thing that we don't talk about, which is when people walk away?
Yeah, so this is so funny, man. When I was in college and training to become a pastor one day, I remember a professor of mine. He's like, I know none of y'all get this yet, but if you end up becoming pastors one day, or, you know, youth pastor or senior pastor or whatever, or worship leader, or some kind of leader, and someone leaves your church or team or whatever, he was like, just know, like, you're going to have to process that, and that's going to hurt. And I remember like listening to him say that and thinking to myself, like, you know, that's, you know, I mean, I would imagine that would be the case. You love people get connected or whatever, and it's hard to see him go. But it's like anything else, man. We're like, it's like the head knowledge versus like when you feel it deeply. And I still remember the first time it hit me. So I just became a pastor. I was probably maybe 25, 26. And I still remember it was a Friday because a couple of friends came over. We were going to go out and do something back when you could go out before the pandemic. You go to Chili's and stuff. And I get this call from a guy who I would consider a very good friend. And he called me and he said, hey man, sorry to bother you. I just want to let you know that, like, you know, me and my wife, man, we love you in the church, but we just feel like God is, you know, moving us on, you know, and calling us to be somewhere else. And dude, my stomach dropped. And it like, dude, I had not felt that way since like I got dumped back in high school. Like it was the last time, and it's really funny, but you know, it feels like that, you know? So if you remember what it's like to be dumped by somebody, that's how that felt. And so anyway, I got off the phone, and for me, man, what was really disillusioning was this was actually the guy who was like really encouraging, nice guy. I still know him to say, really nice guy. But like whenever the church was considering if I was going to become the pastor, I was obviously very young. And so they were like, well, is he ready for this? You know? And I remember being at this like church meeting that was being had, and like people were asking me all these hard questions and just like, you know, complaining about stuff. And he was actually one of the guys that stood up and said, no, man, I think you're called to be the guy. I think that, and he's like, I think you can, like, he was so encouraged, like he had my back, you know? Yeah. And then a year later, just out of the blue, I mean, just totally like left the church and moved on. And I think for me, man, that was when I really learned, like we're talking about pastor confessions. What is it like when someone leaves your church? You know, I'll give you more of like the hopeful side because I feel like I've grown in this. And it honestly, it hurts and it's weird and it feels like you got dumped. That's how I explain it, you know? And I think it's actually a really good thing because I think it shows that you loved and cared about them. If someone leaves your church and you're like, whatever, that means you didn't love them or care for them. And so it's like, if you want someone to care about you and love you and be invested in you, then what that means is like, if you move on, they're gonna, you know, it's gonna hurt, you know? And so that for me, it was one of those things where, you know, it was really hard. It was painful because not only do they leave, is that hard because you feel like, because back then, dude, the church was dying. So it was like, I was supposed to be trying to help like revive this thing, and we're going the wrong direction because we weren't gaining people at that point because it was in such a bad situation. And one of like the young families we had was now just totally leaving. And so I'm like, this is like, I literally thought maybe like the church might not make it. And I felt like not only were they leaving, but now this thing might crumble. It was a really tough time. And so, but the good news was, man, was at least for me, the more I've processed it and have gone through, that's like anything else in life, like you get a lot better at handling it. And part of it was my own lack of trust in God. And so what I can tell you now is though it feels like that and still feels like that some, it's easier for me to handle. But what about you, man? What is it like for you when you're like pastoring over somebody and then they just like bail on the church?
Yeah. I'll tell you, it's really different being a part of a church as like just a member and maybe seeing someone move on versus like being on staff.
Explain the differences of that.
Being a pastor, because it feels like kind of a personal rebuke.
That's
you
a
know?
good word, yeah.
It feels like a personal rebuke that like whatever you were doing wasn't good enough for them or whatever it was. And so I remember the first few times that happened after I came on staff. I think I've been on staff for maybe 4 years now. And I remember early on, as people left, I started rethinking entire ministries, right?
I'm disqualified.
I'm like, no, but rethinking rethinking ministries, rethinking like, maybe we need to do it this way. Like, if we did it this way, would you stay? And I've just noticed that, like, that, first of all, that never works. And two, I will say that, like, now I've come to a place of more confidence in where we are, recognizing that different churches do things different ways, and they focus on different areas of discipleship. And so it makes sense that different people are going to go to different places. So I've come to a more place of peace there, but it doesn't make it easier to have someone leave. And I'll just mention one. So recently, somebody who was fairly involved and kind of like newer, they've been around for a while. I remember I thought everything was good, had a good conversation. I was having good conversations with them and discipleship conversations. And man, they sent me an email and they were like, it was the nicest, it was so good. It was so good because it was such a nice email. But basically they were just saying, hey, you know, we really love you. We love the church, but, you know, we found a place that we connect with better. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I mean, it's still hard. And I shared that with you, you know, but I loved the clarity. And I guess that's what I'm learning over time, is that in order to really move a mission forward, you need people who not only like you, but also like the mission that you're a part of and want to spearhead and be a part of that mission.
So what that's a good thing. So I think one of the things that would be good to talk about is maybe like the differences between the two. And so like, for example, like not all people leaving is the same. So when somebody moves away, that stinks, you know, but for me, at least, that's always felt like different, you know. It's like they moved away. You should go somewhere else. You should not commute 2 hours to come here. Right. I think another one is, like you said, man, I think there's a moment where it's like, you know, I think as long as people, if they try to make it work and they try to get connected, it's like we tried and maybe we just didn't connect, or for whatever reason, like for us, like we're in a lot of ways like a biblical and a modern kind of church. And so like, you know, it's going to be hard if your thing, which I mean, I don't think you should be super into a certain kind of music anyway, you know. But if you're just like, I just need a lot of hymns, you know, for whatever random reason, you know, it's like, that's going to be hard here, you know, kind of a thing. And so that's kind of different. I think sometimes, the two things that make it hard, at least for me, at least, was like, when they don't really give you a reason and they don't say anything, they just leave, you know? And I think a lot of people do that. Usually they just kind of like, I guess it's hard to say they're leaving, you know? And so like this person that emailed you, like at the very least, they kind of explained why or whatever. It's like, he was just honest, like, yeah, we just connect, you know, whatever. And so I think that's where it gets hard. I think also when people kind of like leave and they have some kind of complaint, but they don't talk to you about that complaint. And that's my biggest thing, where it's like, you know, I feel like it's just hard when you don't know something was going on to address it or they didn't say anything. And so it's like, if you have like a legitimate criticism that is legitimate or a problem, and you're saying something and it's not getting addressed, well, that's one thing, you know. But when we find out secondhand, or like, I've already decided to leave before we could even talk about this, I think that's when it kind of hurts, because maybe then you're thinking it's not so much really that thing. It's just kind of like personal. And the last thing I'll say too is a lot of times what happens, and this is our experience, man, this is why this is so important for us, is in our experience with a lot of times the people that have left, the great fear or problem is like a lot of times they don't go somewhere else and thrive, you know? And that's the hard one, because I'm like, is it really like you're leaving, or has the enemy led you astray, you know? Because like, you don't like this place, you go to the next place, you never really connect, you stop going to church, stop walking with the Lord, stop taking your kids. You kind of get to that place where, you know, it's not good for you spiritually. So then we're like, well, you know, should we kind of try to like really connect with them and go after them? But I don't want to be forceful, but I don't want to ignore you. It's this weird thing, you know? And so, but what about you, man? What do you think are some of like the nuances or differences, or like when are there good moments to leave, or what are there moments when like you feel this, but you should probably stay, from your perspective?
Yeah. That's a deeper question than I think we think. And I've researched that question just from a biblical perspective. Like, do we ever think about, besides just my preference, like, are there biblical reasons to leave a church or to stay at a church? And I think honestly, like, as you look into the scripture, there's not a lot of reasons to leave besides like, you know, bad doctrine, false teacher. But I guess we've just watered down this idea of like church membership or participation, like in the Bible, has a very high view of the ecclesia. You know, we are family, like we're together and we're doing life together, thick and thin. But I guess just in our context, there are so many options, so many churches. You know, I've been in parts of the world in which like there's a church in your city, and if you don't like that church, you ain't going to church.
Yeah.
But here it's like there's so many different churches that I guess we sometimes maybe unconsciously water it down and say, if I don't completely vibe with this place, or if they don't do groups the way that I personally would do groups, then I'm going to go somewhere else. And so I just feel like it's something that you have to like kind of check your heart and see kind of, why am I leaving? Is it truly for the spiritual good of my family? Because I think if I'm going to be over here, then I'm going to connect better. I'm going to lead better. I'm going to serve better. You know, all those different things versus like, I didn't like that sermon, or pastor didn't call me, or something like that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, and I think also too, I think, you know, as we think about it, like, I think just getting clarity is like the most important thing as you talk to people. I think as long as you're clear, because I think sometimes, like, I guess that's a good question. Like, what are some reasons? I think one is obviously false teaching. I think another is like, man, the problem is like a lot of times when people say God's just moving me on, I don't buy into it. But sometimes I do think that is legitimate, and that's the hard thing. And sometimes, like I know we had that situation where actually, I mean, so we restarted church, went from being, you know, White Oak Baptist Church to New Day Church, and we were very clear we're a new church, and we voted on it, and the vote passed by a lot. And honestly, man, there were a few people, not that many, honestly. I mean, per like statistics, I mean, we should have lost a lot more people than we did. But we lost a few people. And I think at the heart of it, it was just hard to be a part of a more modern church, you know? And so they went to a more, you know, kind of traditional church, and God bless them. You know, they're going there, serving, helping out. And New Day is becoming what God calls it to be, because there aren't a lot of churches that are, in our minds at least, like kind of modern or reaching the culture, but also biblical, you know? And so, you know, sometimes it does work. And so I do think there's a moment where maybe God does move people on, and it is better for like everybody. And like, almost like if you don't like everything that's happening, if you don't like it, it's like you can either stay and cause like a ruckus, or you can move on to somewhere else. I bless you guys. Like, you know, I see what you're doing or whatever.
And can I just say, man, just if you are having those thoughts, and like those, it's not sinful thoughts to think, you know, maybe I should be somewhere else, but man, process that in community, like, and with leadership,
not just with your wife or your husband.
Yeah, like in community with leadership, and be like, hey, you know, like sit, you know, talk about those things, like, because you know, the worst thing for me is just being totally blindsided by. You know, an email or blindsided when someone doesn't show up, and then like 3 months later, we're like, where are they?
And you know what happens, man? We always say clarity brings prosperity. We probably say that in every podcast. Like we should call the podcast clarity brings prosperity, because what happens in those conversations is, because I've had a few of those conversations, not a lot, but a few, and one of two things happen. Either number one, which this is very rare, it becomes clear maybe you should be somewhere else, you know, like maybe you have a legit calling for whatever reason to be a part of some kind of thing that we just aren't called to do. And so maybe that's a clear sign. Or number two, what usually happens is they begin to kind of express something, and we have a chance to explain, here's why we're doing what we're doing, you know, like we don't just do more modern music because it's cool, you know, like, you know, I mean, I like all kinds of music. Like we do it because we think it helps us like reach people, or we love like the new like songs that God is like bringing into the world, or this is why we do preaching this way. This is why we do groups this way. And we explain it, and they're like, oh, cool. That makes total sense, you know? And like when they finally understand it, but a lot of times what happens is people, they get frustrated and they don't say anything about it. And then at some point we've kind of seen this, like almost like a bitterness and a frustration takes over. It's where like, even at that point when you try to talk about it, it's really hard. And so it's like just assuming the best, like assuming the pastors are not trying to be bad, evil people, you know, and us assuming that people aren't just trying to be like bad, evil or flaky people. You know, we're all trying to serve God, and we're trying to do it together, which is hard, which is why marriage is hard, which is why friendship is hard, which is why work is hard, which is why church is hard. Yeah. And so I think just giving each other an opportunity to explain that is really good. But what about you, man? Because I think this is important for people to know, because like you said, I didn't know this until I became a pastor. And so like, if you're going to be a part of a church and walk with pastors and leaders, it's just important, because I think most people just don't know that, man, it can hurt, or it's hard to process, or you feel like a failure, you let somebody down, or all that kind of stuff. How have you personally become better at it? Because as I said earlier, like we told those stories of like how, man, it really is painful, and it is painful, but I think by God's grace, we've learned to handle it in a much better way. And it's not as quote unquote painful as it used to be. So what about you, man? What are ways that you've processed that and come to like a good understanding place about, handling it within yourself and interacting with people maybe once they leave?
Yeah. Well, first I would go all the way back to the beginning. I think something that we're trying to do better at New Day is kind of, as people are coming into the church, we can't assume that people know what membership is or what church should be or how we interact. And so I think we're trying to be better at the front end about what does it look like to be a part of a church and to teach people and disciple people on that, so that 6 months in or a year in, when those kind of thoughts come, that they don't know how to process or deal
getting
with
better
that.
Being upfront.
Yeah. So being upfront is one. And then two is just like, I've really, can I just say, man, I've really grown to appreciate the people who can be a part of a work that they don't necessarily fully enjoy, I guess. Yeah. And we have people even like that at New Day who would prefer other things or other styles.
Hey, me too.
Right. Back to the 90s music, man. Yeah. Like, so anyway, we have those people. So it makes me really appreciative of them. And so just like, that's a good example for me, even as, I'm a part of a church and I don't get to make all the decisions. And I recognize that we're in partnership on mission together. And then the last one is just like really, this is tough to say, I guess, like real talk, like just recognizing that as people come in, that not everyone is going to stick. And maybe I had that idea when I first became a pastor that, that when someone says they're with you, that means that they're with you for life. And I recognize that's not the case. And so I've come to maybe like be more vulnerable with people who have committed to servant leadership or committed to maybe like my community group. And I kind of entrust myself to them as opposed maybe to every person who comes in. Not that you have to like prove anything to me, but I just have known that like people come in and we're all on temporary assignment,
That's really good. I think for me, man, like, I know one of the things that we're really big on is always like, man, we think people grow the most when they kind of take responsibility or kind of don't give yourself a pass in it. And so one of the things that's helped me personally is just like, I was like, cause I'm always like, okay, so at first it's hurt a lot. Why does this hurt so much? And part of it was like, it was me. Like I wasn't humble enough. And it was like, I thought, well, how could someone leave? I'm excited about this thing. Why, don't y'all see how good this is going to be, kind of thing. And I think for part of it is like, it's really about Jesus. It's not about me, And so to me, like, I think I've grown in humility, and the more I realize it's about Jesus, like, when people are leaving John the Baptist to go to Jesus because his ministry is starting, like, I think I've learned that like part of the reason why it was difficult was because of sin and selfishness in me and wanting this thing that I'm a part of to just go really, really well. So I feel like I've been able to repent of that, and I can see that now. I think also, man, I heard a Tim Keller quote once, which it's so basic. Sometimes the most basic quote is the best one. He was talking about it. Like Tim Keller was like the pastor's pastor. He's like the pastor guru guy, great church planner, all that kind of stuff. And he was talking about how it was tough for him because anyway, it's tough for every pastor. This ain't just us. This is every pastor. We talk about this behind closed doors. This is very difficult. He said, yeah, it used to really be difficult for me. He's like, eventually I just learned, hey, like not everyone likes your church, cause like, he's like pastor of Redeemer, and I guess they're more traditional in some senses, and he's like a very intellectual preacher. And he's like, yeah, like I'm an intellectual preacher. Some people like that. Some people think I'm boring, And so I was just like, yeah, some different churches have different feels, different culture. And so for me, it's like, listen, like I know who New Day is, and I'm excited about what God is doing. And like, not everyone's going to like that. We've had friends that have come that we thought like, oh, they're going to love this. And they were like, yeah, it's just not kind of our style. We've had other people we didn't think would stick at all. And they're like, man, I love this place. And so I think for me, just realizing, there's a lot of different churches. It's not like we are all in on New Day and what we're doing, but like there's other great churches that are doing great things. So just realizing like God works in that too. And I think the last thing too, is I think just like you said, man, I think just being clear with people up front. I feel like it happened. I think people often, or at this point, leave less often now because I do think that we're kind of clear up front in our class. Whereas I remember early on, man, I would just like bring people in. It was all relational, They would come because like they would like be good friends with me or something. Yeah. But then like if I couldn't hang out with them 24/7 or like I couldn't come over for dinner, they're like, well, I'm gonna be around the pastor, so I'm gonna bail, And I think now people come because they like what we're doing and not just like us, and which has been very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would just say, just to harken back to your like humility thing, just recognizing that there really are great churches in Houston, and our thing is not that everyone would come to New Day, and so that we can get our numbers up, is that the gospel would go out, and that people would be on mission with us to help people find their new day in Jesus' name. And there are other churches doing great works. And so as long as whoever's listening, like, as long as you're a part of a gospel-centered church that's about Jesus and about the Great Commission, then man, like, go forth like in his power.
And I think also, as we come to a close, I think one thing I think that would be really good to mention is, I think if you're watching this, and this is good for any kind of person, pastor, member, whatever, I think one of the things I've been rediscovering this season is like the power of encouragement. And I would just always seek to encourage everybody around you, whether it's your pastor or other leaders or people in your church or whatever, and just let them know, like, if you are, because we're here talking about people that leave. Most people don't leave. Yeah. Most people stay, most people love their church, right? Most people are committed. Most people know it's not going to be perfect and they stay, right? I would always encourage everybody, like, to really be encouraging and really vocal about the things that you love, because just know, like, we're always hearing the things that people don't love, And so just assume like everyone around you is always hearing all the bad stuff. Like, man, as a church, let's be the people, ourselves included, who are always like speaking the encouragement. And like you said, man, like, probably our next podcast should be like, we've talked about what's it like for a pastor when someone leaves. What's it like when someone stays and is faithful? We should have that conversation, because that's probably 97% of the people. And so if you are one of those people and you are faithful, just know, like, you are so appreciated, and we think of you so much in affectionate ways. And if you do leave, we love you too. We're still on the same team, and I think that's a really good way to process it. But I think all in all, it's just important for people to know that it is hard when people leave your church. I think people don't think about that. But God is still glorified in whatever happens. And, like I said, we're always all working together. So any final thoughts on your end, man?
No, just a reminder that, we're humans too. And people who leave your church are humans, and people who stay are humans. Like, we're all broken. We all need Jesus. And as long as we see ourselves as one big family, that really helps out a lot. So, man, thank you guys for watching again. And we hope to see you next time.